Dozens more Australians and Afghans have been airlifted out of Kabul airport on the third Australian rescue flight out of Afghanistan. However, many Australians are still unable to access the airport with chaotic scenes there. Joining me live now for more on this is former Special Forces Commando Wes Hennessey. Thank you for your time. Now, you've had extensive experience in Afghanistan. You've had 10 deployments there, as well as served on operational missions and advisories. What do you make of the Australian government's evacuation efforts?
I think now we're starting to get underway, and I think as of today we've got 200 something odd people out. However, I think we were too slow to start, and more should have been done earlier. ADF was certainly more capable. There's a lot of the media and both the politicians out there, all essentially coming from the leadership, are stating that they didn't have enough warning, whereas I think the warning signs were there because it was being screened by a lot of independent medias, was as the Taliban started to approach Kabul. So we certainly had time, and I think we would have been much better postured if we moved some forces forward into Al Minhad, our forward operating base in the Middle East, to better posture ourselves for the rescue before the chaos started.
And in terms of all the efforts being directed at the airport solely, do you think that the Australian Defence Force should also be looking at minimising the Taliban's presence elsewhere as well?
It's certainly, that's something that should be considered in the next step or phase. There are already UK Special Operations units, German and French, that are operating out of the airport. The importance of this is at the moment, and the fact that it is all Kabul-centric, if you could imagine evacuating New South Wales and everybody without public transport or without motor vehicles had to get to Sydney. So that presents a lot of problems for a lot of the Afghani people, let alone the communications, where to meet, etc. We've all seen the footage of Kabul airport. It's absolutely chaotic. So I think it's very important soon, if we're serious about it, that we have the correctly enabled forces that move from Kabul airport out and start collecting people at designated rendezvous points.
And what about in terms of the numbers of people that are getting on these aircraft, on these planes? Do you think that the Australian government should be doing more to get more people out?
I think certainly it was a little bit embarrassing, especially with our first flight. That was a C-130 Hercules. Seated, it was capable of about 126, 128 persons, I believe, and we took out 25. When you look at the example of what the Americans did on that infamous C-17 flight, renowned as Reach 817, I believe, that took out, which was initially reported as 640 persons, but now when they've done a final count with the children and babies, etc., it's actually 830 or 840 or something. So a magnificent effort by them. Also, we've had some Australians getting on some of the British flights. So, I think we need to, when we get a plane in there, I know there's a lot of security concerns, but get those planes to capacity and get them out.
So Australians are actually getting on British flights, not Australian flights, to get out?
Correct. Yeah, that has happened on one case that we know of, which is, at the end of the day, they've got out safely, and that's what's important. But it would have been good to see some of those early Australian flights do a little bit more.
Absolutely. And aside from the evacuation efforts, when it comes to the Taliban, you've had extensive experience with them. We're hearing different rhetoric now that they're saying there'll be less barbaric, there'll be less brutality. How should that be taken? Yeah,
I don't think we can believe a single word the Taliban says. And if we do, there's a high chance of that coming back to bite us in the near future or having a negative effect. Some of the leadership starting to talk about maybe, offering them, diplomatic means to come to better arrangements, etc., essentially negotiating with them. This is one of the most ruthless and relentless terrorist organisations in the world. They've got a lot of confidence at the moment. They've just gained a formidable amount of resources through equipment that they've seized through the Afghan security forces. So now is certainly not the time to be negotiating with them. Understand, they feel that they need to, and there is an element of truth to that, to get the security that we require. But certainly we need to be taking a firm hand with them very soon.
And you have also just finally been quite vocal about the commentary surrounding the ADF's involvement over the past 20 years or so, that these efforts have been for nothing. What's your response to that? It is quite damaging.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, and the message is getting out now. I've seen recently senior members, our senior leadership in the ADF, and also our leaders, political leaders, But initially hearing the words that it was a waste of time, and still to this day hearing that through some medias. This is extremely damaging to the Australian veteran community. There's 39,000 troops that served or enabled the operations in Afghanistan. So that's a lot of people. We had 450 plus combat casualties, and not to forget the 41 heroes who died in Afghanistan. So there's a wide impact on the Afghanistan war, the longest war Australia's ever been involved in across the Australian community. And I think it's really important that at this time in particular, whilst our veterans are watching these distressing scenes, that we reassure them that it wasn't a waste.
And are you still involved within the veteran community? What would you say to anyone watching now?
I would say that your efforts, as in your operational service in Afghanistan, wasn't a waste. To remind yourself of all the good work that you did do, whether it was training Afghan security forces, whether you're an engineer and you created a bridge for some kids to get to school, or whether you helped educate people in any way. We have left a considerable mark on that country, and there is still a lot of good there that we have done and enabled. And I think all Australian veterans need to remind themselves of that fact.
A very important message. Thank you so much for your time, Wes Hennessey.
Thanks, Anna.